yn fawr iawn. Diolch yn fawr am y gwahoddiad. Y bydd cynta I fi wneud ydy ymddiheiro am peidio defnyddio'r Cymraeg. I can hardly speak, or rather I can hardly write a paper in English, so I will stick to that language. I've changed a little bit the title of my contribution here, an agricultural oasis in the Patagonian desert, because I'm going to start talking about the desert as a kind of representation. And it is almost a commonplace to consider Patagonia as almost a synonym of remoteness. However, at a time when ships had to sail that far south to reach the Pacific Ocean, the region was visited by a large number of travelers of different origins. And it was them who started to forge the image of Patagonia as a desert. Charles Darwin, which you know, of course, to name a well-known traveler, presented Patagonia as a stratigraphical landscape which could be read and also seen as a kind of open-air museum of the history of the planet. But apart from that, Darwin's descriptions basically helped forging a strong association of Patagonia with the figure of the desert. And I think this quotation here is quite eloquent about that. It was not a very positive description of what he saw in Patagonia. In part, it was from the work of these early travelers that early Argentine writers borrowed a series of literary images with which they laid the foundations of some sort of identity of the land and its inhabitants. And desert was one of the typical images, not just any image within a larger group. Desert was a fundamental figure of landscape representation in the history of Argentina. And we have to blame this gentleman here in the middle for this. Basically, Sarmiento was the first to formulate a dilemma that proved as prolific as inescapable in Argentina's history, a dilemma between barbarism and civilization. If in terms of territorial representation, civilization was a synonym of the city, a city from which progress and civism was irradiated, the figure that stood for barbarism was the desert. Of course, desert, in its opposition to the civilizing city, was a duality that had its political implications in mid-19th century Argentina, but of course this is an issue that falls outside the scope of our lecture today. However, two things must be said about Patagonia and its representation as the desert. That's Sarmiento again, and a very important book that he wrote, Facundo. So the first thing is related to place names or terms in general. If desert was a figure used by Sarmiento to characterize the vast plains of known as the Pampas, that is to the north of Patagonia, when that territory was annexed to Argentina and became very rapidly the agricultural heartland of the country, the use of the term desert was displaced southwards and became almost a synonym of Patagonia. May I also add that together with the term, the vast majority of the indigenous tribes living in the Pampas were also displaced to Patagonia, where they were confined to the less productive areas of the region when they were not annihilated by the military campaigns carried out in the 1860s and 1880s. The second thing concerns our interest in Wladfa here, because founding new cities was not the only means to fight these impenetrable deserts. Sarmiento wanted the new white population to take root, so he was very much in favor of creating a new society of farmers in these regions. And with that in mind, he promoted the creation of agricultural colonies. Agricultural colonies were one of the most promoted devices of territorial control, where European laborers, seen then as agents of civilizations, could settle permanently and prosper. and of course the creation of the domestic space, that belonged to families that were laboring families, was central in the success of this policy of agricultural colonization implemented from the 1950s onwards, not only in Patagonia but in other parts of Argentina as well. Sorry. And as I was saying, agriculture was central as a means for rooting the new population. We have to remember that the population traditionally associated with the so-called desert was mainly nomadic, mainly gauchos or indigenous population or indigenous tribes. Well, rather were said to be nomadic at that time. I mean, recent research has shown that some of those tribes did cultivate the land and also adopted various practices which we could associate to date with permanent settlements, like building, for example, erecting buildings. Colonies were also important for the state to take hold of these vast extensions, especially in the case of Patagonia, a region that as late as the 1890s was still under dispute with Chile. It is interesting to note that many 19th century maps, I'm showing a very well-known map here now, still show Patagonia as a kind of distinct territorial entity, yeah? Separated both from Chile and from Argentina. And the same thing did the Sauliver, published in 1862 by Hugh Hughes. So that is why the national state eagerly supported this group of Welsh people interested in creating a first agricultural colony in Patagonia, something that nobody had done before. And the question here, of course, is what it was like for these Welsh colonies to settle in a territory which was already known by many, by the vast majority, as a desert. In previous works, I have focused on what this contact with the desert actually meant for the Welsh. Early chronicles show that they cultivated a biblical version of the desert, a desert that was a sort of transitional experience on a journey to the promised land, to the land that they're with. And of course, it's interesting to remember that the first anthem, the first emin that Abraham Matthews chose in his first service in Trorauson was the one that went Ofrenia Carsalem Caerdydd der Holldaeth yr Anialwch I Gyd. You know, the subject of his sermon was exactly that. You know, the transition of the children of Israel in the desert. It could be argued that the desert was also transitional from the linguistic point of view, because when they had to refer to the expanses of Patagonia, Welsh chroniclers tended to avoid the term Anialwch, which means literally desert, and they preferred Paith, which was obviously less derogative, and it suited and it was better for the promotional purposes of much of what was initially written in Welsh about the region. But if this is a problem of representation of the territory, I would like to address today a much more practical problem, which arises from the fact that the 190 millimeters of rainfall, of annual rainfall, were clearly not sufficient for the colonists to cultivate the land successfully. Even when authors like Hugh Hughes had painted a picture in which Patagonia looked almost as green as Wales, some of the organizers of the venture, like Edwin Roberts, might have been aware of the fact that cultivation was impossible to practice without the use of artificial irrigation. Going back to symbols and ideas now, William Casnodin Rees, a Baptist minister, used in his chronicle the analogy of the Sphinx. In classical tradition, the Sphinx represented an enigma that had to be solved. And for Rees, that enigma was clearly how to live in the desert, and hence how settlers could grow their own crops there and live there. It is obvious that the key to that enigma was irrigation. However, it took quite a long time for the settlers to prove that the whole of the lower Chubut Valley could be irrigated with the waters of the Chubut River. So we can say that this enigma took many years to be actually sort of solved or deciphered. And this explains why the early history of Wladfa was a long period of trial and error in which different ways of providing irrigation were put into practice. A first stage associated with the so-called discovery of immigration. I've heard reference here to Aaron Jenkins and his wife discovering, so to speak, the irrigation. So this first stage of the use of irrigation depended on the rising of the level of the river. Yes, which was a natural phenomenon on which the colonies could not rely completely, of course. So in this early period in which the colonies had not yet moved to their respective farms, both irrigation and agriculture was restricted to the areas known as a drefnwyd. We're looking here at a very interesting map by Thomas Dodds. What's the drefnwyd? The drefnwyd is the land in and around the numerous meanders of the Chubut River, which the Welsh settlers started to use as to cultivate different crops next to Rawson. They were still living in Rawson during the first decade, and actually, it's interesting if we look, for example, at the cofnodion Wladfa, that is the notes that Berwyn actually took of the different sessions of the council. We will see there that what the council actually did at that time was to rent land in this drefnwyd. So this is before the valley was actually subdivided into different farms and then occupied. But of course, the main problem was how to ensure a permanent flow in the irrigation canals that were supposed to take the water to the different farms that now in 1875, the whole of the valley was actually measured and subdivided into different farms, more than 300 farms. So how to ensure this constant flow of water into the canals? From the early dams used during the first years to raise the level of the Chubut River in order to catch and divert its waters into the canal, to the different canals, we need to move into a second and more successful period in which the dam strategy was finally discarded as an option, and it was decided to locate the intakes of the different canals far upstream from the areas of the valley that were being occupied and labored at that time. And what we are looking at here is two interesting things. I don't know if it's possible to, if you look at this map here, you will see this is the second map, which was drawn in around 1886, which is very interesting because it shows the owners of every farm. But apart from that, it shows the canals that were already being built. Yeah? And we also find the sites in which the first dams in the river were erected. Yeah? And all of them failed, of course. And what this second image shows here is the what was left of one of these dams that were erected with stones that were actually quarried locally. It was an incredible job that they did with very few tools, and they did last that I know at least 3 times. Yeah. So after this failure, they decided to try other solutions. Yeah, and the solution was, as I was saying, to locate the intakes of the different canals in this area, where, of course, the gradient was enough for water to flow naturally along the valley. And this was implemented after the arrival of Edward John Williams, a land surveyor from Mostyn in North Wales, who was responsible for the design of most of the irrigation network in the 1880s. Although this was known already by some of the colonists, Edward Jones Williams' contribution for the design of the network was related also with the possibility of taking advantage of the topography of the valley floor. Obviously, gravity is the force used by these irrigation systems, so the topography was a key element here. Not only the consideration of the west-east gradient that allowed Williams to successfully locate, as I said, the intakes of the canals in the upper reaches of the river, but also the internal topographical variations that we can see in this cross-section here. This cross-section here was drawn by David Lloyd Jones, a colonist who was here studying the possibility of restructuring the administration of irrigation. It's quite an interesting document because it's actually the only cross-section of the valley that I found in any document. But the cross-section here shows that most canals were laid out in areas that were either close to the river, yeah, on either side of the river. This is the river and these are the 2 canals on both sides, or close to the hills, also on either side of the valley. The location of the canals in these areas that were higher than the rest of the valley, of the valley floor, allowed for a better distribution of water by means of secondary canals or ditches. Yeah. Exceptionally, when this was not possible, colonists built artificial conduits like the ones we see in this picture here. Based on this principle that combines the inescapable gravity with the recognition of the valley's inner topography, the colonists built a pretty impressive irrigation network. By mid-1880s, that network had reached an extension of 90 miles. And a decade later, that extension had almost doubled, with the capacity of the canals being improved as well. It's interesting to see that when Lewis Jones includes a map in his book, a map of the Chubut Valley, he calls the Chubut Valley irrigated valley of Chubut already. This is the 1890s. Yeah? But I'm not interested in going into detail about how the network was extended through the years. I would prefer to look at the various implications of the construction and also the upkeeping of this system of canals. First of all, this network had a tremendous influence on the way the territory of the valley was organized and ultimately managed. Yeah? The centrality of the network was inescapable, mainly because of a series of conflicts that derived from the overlapping of these winding layouts of the irrigation canals and the gridiron structure that defined both property boundaries and roads, which is this structure rectilinear structures that you see here. The conflicts derived from these intersections were the subject of the first important piece of legislation passed in 1887 by the municipality of Chubut, which was an institution which inherited this ambitious autonomic, or these autonomic ambitions that the first Kengor had, in the beginning. So it can be said that this law dealt primarily with bridges. Who, when, how these bridges had to be built to cross the different canals, and also who was responsible for upkeeping. All these issues were part of this law that sought to regulate the space of the valley. Actually, this is just a copy of the book where we find both the Llyfr Deddfa, it was this, and this was another, well, las ordenanzas, Deddfa. The interesting thing about this book is that it was kept for almost 10 years in Welsh and in Spanish, in the two languages. And this is where we find this first 1887 law. So we were talking about bridges, yeah? So given the number of crossing points, Lewis Jones in his book talks about this complicated system of overlapping, between the roads and the irrigation canals, and says that it cannot be understood by anyone coming from outside the valley. So this number of crossing points, when we look at them, and then when we look at the photographic vistas taken by the colonists, well, it's not surprising that bridges became one of the most usual subjects in these vistas taken by local photographers. And I'm referring not only to those bridges crossing the Chubut River, like this one here, which at the time were regarded as a kind of technological feat by the colonies' carpenters, but I'm referring basically, well, this is another one, to the small bridges crossing the irrigation canals that we have been referring to, like this one, for example. The nature of this primitive infrastructure shows that during most of the 19th century, the Welsh colonies had not yet completed their entrance into what Lewis Mumford calls the Paleotechnic era. That is an era related with the use of iron and coal-fired and steam-powered production. Although a railway line linking the valley with the nearby port of Madrid was already in operation, as you know, in 1888. When it comes to some other aspects of their economic life, like flour production, for example, or construction, the colonists were still living in what Lewis Mumford calls the Eotechnic era, before the era of the steam-powered production. And in a way, watermills, the first watermills, are an evidence of that. And it's interesting to know that these watermills were powered by the irrigation canals themselves. And also, instead of industrial machinery that was adopted at a later date, traditional millstones were used to grind the grain in the first mills. And the construction of bridges is also interesting, because those initial bridges had more to do with traditional carpentry than with modern engineering using metallic large span structures as the ones we see here and I'm not this is not just any example, because what we see here is a similar irrigation project, but being developed by the British-owned Southern Railway Company in Rio Negro, which is just north of Chubut. Yeah? But what we see here is a completely different technology being used. Yeah? But this is actually what the Rio Negro looks like, how the Rio Negro also at a later date became an agricultural oasis, yeah? Following a completely different way of using and managing the territory and managing the irrigation, basically. Sorry, having problems with my... So the extension of this irrigation network is also central to understand that the transformation of this remote valley into a sort of agricultural oasis. As I was saying, this transformation brought about a change in the way landscape was perceived and also represented. As we approached the 19th century, the colony started to be described and praised as a garden of sorts, setting a clear limit to this generalization through which Patagonia became and becomes still a synonym of desert. And these photographs, although these photographs are from the Rio Negro, are quite eloquent about this oasis kind of character. Yeah? Of course, my point is that the difference between Rio Negro Valley and Chubut Valley is related with the way this agricultural oasis or garden was actually represented, because what we don't have in Rio Negro is a series of poetic images of that garden that we do have in Chubut. But irrigation also had some important socio-political implications which should not be overlooked. And here we need to look at the way in which irrigation was actually managed. And the first thing that we need to remember is that the settlers started building the irrigation network in a rather inorganic way. Societies were formed in different districts of the valley with the purpose of meeting the irrigation needs of only the ones who settled in those areas. In a way, this was a decentralized and self-managed way of dealing with communal matters, which can be compared, possibly, to the way in which non-conformist religious congregations were actually formed in Patagonia and perhaps in Wales too. This map that we found in Glyn Williams' The Welsh in Patagonia is quite eloquent about this geographical criteria that we find beneath with the formation of every congregation in the valley. Those are the chapels that we still find within the valley. Which, you know, there are some, of course, we could spend the whole day discussing this, but the congregation was a kind of ideal community in the Chubut Valley, and the scale of it was interesting. And the political implications of this can be extended to irrigation societies, if you want. Even when the different irrigation societies had to conform a single entity at a later date, the so-called Compañía Unida de Irrigación, every branch, or kangen, as they were called, retained its autonomy when it came to administration of irrigation. Similarly, cleaning of the canals during the winter was also a communal event that had to do with a certain canal or certain district. Yeah. As you might know, the construction of the canals was a task that was collectively undertaken, We have said already that those who benefited from the construction of canals united to form a single society. This was done through the implementation of the system of shares, which were distributed in accordance with the length of canal completed by every farmer. The number of shares also determined the area that could be irrigated by the shareholder in every farm. If we had enough time, it would be very interesting to go into detail about how the system worked and how it changed during the first decades of the 20th century. For today, I would like to start finishing this presentation, bringing to the fore the question of ownership. Ownership of the irrigation infrastructure, because I think it's a question that is central to understand not only the dispute over the management of this key resource, but also the process which irrigation, the process through which the irrigation was finally disengaged from a series of practices and institutions that had been founded by the Welsh in Patagonia. Because beyond this decentralized administration that we have referred to here, the foundational principle on which the irrigation company existed, I'm going to see a pretty obvious thing, was that the company actually owned both the infrastructure and the water conveyed by that infrastructure. This assumed ownership was a fundamental economic principle and was at the very basis of the development of the early irrigation societies. Now, the problem is that from the 1920s onwards, this assumption that one can perceive very easily by reading a Drafod, for example, was started to be into question by those who believed that the provision of water for any purpose, including irrigation, was a public service and as such had to be run by the state. These are just a few examples of, if we look at a Drafod during the 1930s and 1940s, there are some issues of the Drafod that are, I would say, like a third of them are devoted to irrigation. Yeah? So after the 1999 economic crisis, which paved the way for a more active involvement of state-owned institutions in different spheres, but especially in the economy, the consensus on the necessity of having state-run irrigation systems grew considerably and paved the way to the final nationalization of the system in 1943, a measure that many members of the old irrigation company resisted and opposed, and in fact, some of them sued the national state for that. It's interesting, 1943 can be seen as a kind of turning point, not only in the history of this colony, but also in Argentina's history. It was then that a coup d'etat allowed the military to take a more decisive step in the control of strategic resources like oil, like coal, and we have to remember that this happened in the middle of the Second World War. And this was particularly the case in Patagonia, a region that started to be seen as a reserve of energy and mineral resources, this being actually a long-lasting imagery of Patagonia that is going to be more and more important as we move into the 20th century. And it is now still considered like that in Argentina. And this is exactly the point in which the Chubut Valley that had been settled by the colonies lose its center in the Chubut province, because from now on, from the 1940s onwards, Comodoro Rivadavia, that is the cradle of oil exploitation in Argentina, is going to be the center of the province. It is not a coincidence that some of the members of this conference come from Comodoro Rivadavia, and it is not coincidence that some of the Welsh who lived in the Welsh colony that at some point can be regarded as an area that corresponds precisely with the Chubut Valley, or perhaps also with the Andean settlement, started to move to Comodoro Rivadavia as well. Walter came from Comodoro, Guillermo also come from Comodoro. So I just wanted to finish by presenting this open scenario of the 1940s, which is I think it's a new scenario, which has tended to be overlooked, especially with the advent of Peronism and how Peronism related with what were the relationships between Peronism and the Welsh community, which is also, I think, central to understand this kind of black hole in the history of the colony in the 1950s, where all the institutions and practices started to cease. The estate vote, and there are many practices and institutions that actually disappeared and had to be sort of reinvented with the centenary in 1865. So, thank you. That's all.